Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer. Today, we're applying an uncompromising, deeply academic lens to deconstruct the actual literal mathematics of conflict. We'll be examining Chapter 174, the Third Inversion. This is a pivotal historical record that treats wrath not just as some fleeting human emotion, but as a hyper-accelerated kinetic engine. The central, unyielding axiom we are exploring today is this: wrath functions as a system that demands a strike and absolutely mandates a counterstrike. And to achieve absolute mastery over the system, it requires a deliberate, conscious anomaly to violate its geometric progression. That's how you invert the shadow of vengeance into balanced justice.
So, here is the blueprint for our structural breakdown today. We are going to analyze exactly how an infinite feedback loop of hatred was shattered, not by brute force, but by deliberate algorithm and structural inversion. We'll start with a thermodynamic trap, map out the triangle of structural momentum, break down the calculus of vengeance, examine the non-reactive climax, and finally look at the lex equilibrium. Let's get started.
Part 1. The Thermodynamic Trap. To really understand this, we have to look at the geographic foundation of the conflict, the brutal, high-density topography of the Iron Marches. We're looking at the twin citadels of Skell and Valen, physically divided by this jagged limestone cleft known as the Valley of Red Stones, where the rivers are literally tinted a dark, rust-brown hue. But here's the crucial structural takeaway. These aren't just two neighboring enemy cities. For 7 centuries, they have operated together as reciprocal halves of an undivided engine of hatred. It is a completely closed-circuit system. The structural brittleness of this society is absolute, simply because social status is entirely determined by ancestors lost. And this brilliantly illustrates the systemic flaw driving this engine, what is known as the Fourth Primordial Shadow. Now, we shouldn't think of this as just an abstract philosophy. It's a universal instinct for equilibrium that has been codified into a permanent geometric progression of wrath. It's an endless reprisal loop. Every single action within the Iron Marches is fundamentally forced to be a reaction to the precise memory of a preceding injury. Moving on to Part 2, the triangle of structural momentum. An engine this massive cannot sustain itself without specialized infrastructure. It has to distribute the heavy structural load of this violent flame across localized points of failure. We can map this as a stark 3-part diagram. 3 anchors that lock both factions into a closed-circuit battery of emotional energy. First, you have High Castellan Jarek of Valen. He is the administrative sword, enforcing an unyielding perfectionism of malice that literally redefines diplomacy as betrayal. Second, you have Grand Archivist Malakor of Skell, the keeper of the red ledgers. And third, a terrifying physical anchor, the Mourning Blade. Let's look closer at Grand Archivist Malakor. To understand his role, we have to examine the red ledgers themselves. This quote right here really hits the nail on the head regarding the system's devastating logic. Guilt is mathematically transmissible through lineage. Malakor used these ledgers to mathematically prove bloodline liability for historical crimes. Think about how insidious that is. It weaponizes memory, constantly convincing every new generation of young soldiers that their very existence requires a blood payment for crimes they didn't even commit. Then we have the third anchor, which makes de-escalation a physical impossibility. The Mourning Blade is a massive greatsword forged from sky-fallen iron, acting as the kinetic conduit for the system's momentum. It violently suppresses the very concept of peace. If a mortal even harbors a fleeting thought of forgiveness, this blade vibrates with a high-pitched, agonizing drone. And that sound, it can only be silenced by the drawing of blood. Which brings us to Part 3. The calculus of vengeance. Now, what's really interesting about this next phase is Commander Kaelin's systemic intervention. He didn't try to fight magic with more magic. He approached this with total academic detachment, treating the generational war as a failing thermodynamic equation. Look at the raw algebra of the red vector here. He treated deep emotional injuries as cold, hard variables. We have V, the output violence, functioning as a product of G, the generational propagation factor, and that is multiplied by the sum of past injuries and future retributions. The absolute key here is identifying G as the transmission medium across time. By looking at this mathematically, Castellan proved that traditional retaliatory justice naturally diverges toward infinity. Why? Because it introduces an emotional inflation friction margin, what we might call variable mu. Think about it conversationally. Every time you strike back, you have to hit just a little bit harder than you were hit, right? Just to make it feel like justice. This retaliatory inflation balloons the input debts on an exponential curve. Once the resource cost of this inflation exceeds the generative capacity of the society, total civilizational destruction isn't just a possibility, it becomes a guaranteed mathematical certainty.
That takes us to part 4, the non-reactive climax.
So let's trace the split-second timeline of how Castellan forced this kinetic energy to actually collapse at Archon's Keep. At T-2 seconds, we have impact anticipation. High Castellan Jarek is wielding the glowing Mourning Blade. Then at T0, Castellan steps entirely unarmed into the killing zone. He publicly audits the ancestral debts, but deliberately inserts a temporal whitespace delay, a delta T. By purposefully absorbing the potential energy of the strike at T+1 and absolutely refusing to offer a counterstrike, he starves the mathematical equation. By T+3 seconds, he achieves total system collapse by severing the transmission medium. And the physical consequence of violating this geometric progression was absolute. Castellan coupled his systemic authority with total conscious absorption. His non-reactive clarity hit that violent fire like an unyielding wall. The colossus of ash and flame completely dissolved. And the Mourning Blade itself, it shattered into 1,000 useless fragments of dull gray iron. The polarity of the entire system was reversed.
Finally, part 5, the Lex Equilibrium. Let's move on and see how this builds into a new post-inversion baseline. You can't just break an infinite cycle and leave nothing behind. Castellan immediately transformed the military's logistical framework into equilibrium councils. Those notorious red ledgers were translated into transparent registries. Instead of continuing this geometric feedback loop of blood debt, injuries were strictly repurposed as finite, isolated deficits requiring labor-based restitution. This new reality was codified as the Lex Equilibrium. It is the framework of decentralized stabilization. It means material cross-border dependencies permanently replace infinite cycles of retaliation. To put that into perspective, the common soul becomes the foundation stone. They tied their logistical and material survival together so tightly that a strike against your enemy mathematically becomes a strike against yourself. This is the permanent reversal into the sovereign virtue of balanced justice. Now, we must remember that within the broader universal archival matrix, a systemic victory of this magnitude triggers a cosmic audit. Looking out from the ash dunes of the frozen gray wastes, an entity known as Watcher Belial records the stabilization of this red vector into the eternal ledger. So the crucial point we have to take away from Belial's observation is this. Peace is not an inherited trait. It is a baseline stabilizer that demands active, continuous maintenance. As Belial notes, the ink remains permanently wet for every generation, and even more chillingly, as the heat of wrath freezes into order, the absolute zero of a new shadow, sloth, is already gathering in the far north.
We've seen today how a hyper-accelerated kinetic engine of hatred can be dismantled through rigorous logic, deliberate temporal delay, and structural restitution. But it leaves us with a deeply foreboding systemic question. If the infinite feedback loop of wrath can be shattered by conscious, mathematical balance, how will the human soul defend itself against the absolute zero of sloth, slowly gathering to convince us that nothing matters at all? It's a structural anomaly we will all eventually have to face. Thank you for joining me for this explainer.